Did you know that the Roman Empire is one of the most influential civilizations in history? They created a republic in 509 BC, and at its peak, their influence stretched from Spain to Egypt. But their success didn't last forever. The Roman Republic was built on the backs of slaves, and as the empire grew, so did the wealth gap between the rich and the poor. Eventually, it became so bad that Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators in 44 BC. After that, Rome became an empire ruled by emperors. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, lasted for 200 years. But after that, things started to go downhill. The empire was too big to be ruled by one person, and as the provinces became more independent, the power of the central government declined. By the 3rd century AD, Rome had become a shadow of its former self, and in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire fell to the barbarians. But the story of Rome didn't end there. The Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, lasted for another 1,000 years, fall in the West and survival in the East. The Western Roman Empire began to disintegrate in the early 5th century. The Romans fought off all invaders, most famously Attila, but the empire had assimilated so many Germanic peoples of dubious loyalty to Rome that the empire started to dismember itself. Most chronologies place the end of the Western Roman Empire in 476, when Romulus Augustulus was forced to abdicate to the Germanic warlord Odoacer. Odoacer ended the Western Empire by declaring Zeno sole emperor and placing himself as Zeno's nominal subordinate. In reality, Italy was ruled by Odoacer alone. The Eastern Roman Empire, called the Byzantine Empire by later historians, continued until the reign of Constantine II Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor. He died in battle in 1453 against Mehmed II and his Ottoman forces during the siege of Constantinople. Mehmed II adopted the title of Caesar in an attempt to claim a connection to the former empire. His claim was soon recognized by the Patriarchate of Constantinople, but not by European monarchs. Demography of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire's population has been estimated at between 59 and 76 million in the 1st and 2nd centuries, peaking probably just before the Antonine Plague. Historian Kyle Harper provides an estimate of a population of 75 million and an average population density of about 20 people per square kilometer at its peak, with unusually high urbanization. During the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the population of the city of Rome is conventionally estimated at 1 million inhabitants. Historian Ian Morris estimates that no other city in Western Eurasia would have as many again until the 19th century. Papyrus evidence from Roman Egypt suggests, like other more recent and thus better documented pre-modern societies, the Roman Empire experienced high infant mortality, a low marriage age, and high fertility within marriage. Perhaps half of the Roman subjects died by the age of 10. Of those still alive at age 10, half would die by the age of 50. Due to migration, the ethnic composition of the city of Rome, its vicinity, and Italy as a whole went through substantial change during the early and later stages of the empire, with the migration divisible mainly in 2 separate periods. First during the Principate from eastern Mediterranean areas, and later beginning from the dominate by northern and western European peoples, continuing throughout the medieval ages and the early modern period. The resultant changes are reflected in the differences between northern and southern Italy to this day. The genetic distance between northern and southern Italians, although large for a single European nationality, is similar to that between the northern and the southern Germans. Geography and demography. The Roman Empire was one of the largest in history, with contiguous territories throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The Latin phrase imperium sine fine, empire without end, expressed the ideology that neither time nor space limited the empire. In Virgil's Aeneid, limitless empire is said to be granted to the Romans by Jupiter. This claim of universal dominion was renewed when the empire came under Christian rule in the 4th century. In addition to annexing large regions, the Romans directly altered their geography, for example, cutting down entire forests. Roman expansion was mostly accomplished under the Republic, though parts of northern Europe were conquered in the 1st century, when Roman control in Europe, Africa, and Asia was strengthened. Under Augustus, a global map of the known world was displayed for the first time in public at Rome. coinciding with the creation of the most comprehensive political geography that survives from antiquity, the geography of Strabo. When Augustus died, the account of his achievements, res gestae, prominently featured the geographical cataloging of the empire. Geography, alongside meticulous written records, were central concerns of Roman imperial administration. A segment of the ruins of Hadrian's Wall in northern England, overlooking Crag Lough, the empire reached its largest expanse under Trajan, R 98-117, encompassing 5 million km cui. The traditional population estimate of 55 to 60 million inhabitants accounted for between 1/6 and 1/4 of the world's total population and made it the most populous unified political entity in the West until the mid-19th century. Recent demographic studies have argued for a population peak from 70 million to more than 100 million. Each of the three largest cities in the empire, Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, was almost twice the size of any European city at the beginning of the 17th century, as the historian Christopher Kelly described it. Then the empire stretched from Hadrian's Wall in drizzle-soaked northern England to the sun-baked banks of the Euphrates in Syria, from the great Rhine-Danube river system, which snaked across the fertile, flat lands of Europe, from the Low Countries to the Black Sea, to the rich plains of the North African coast and the luxuriant gash of the Nile Valley in Egypt. The empire completely circled the Mediterranean, referred to by its conquerors as Mare Nostrum, our sea. Roman cities in the imperial period. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, adopted a policy of maintaining rather than expanding the empire. Borders, fines, were marked, and the frontiers, limits, patrolled. The most heavily fortified borders were the most unstable. Hadrian's Wall, which separated the Roman world from what was perceived as an ever-present barbarian threat, is the primary surviving monument of this effort. Languages. Latin and Greek were the main languages of the empire, but the empire was deliberately multilingual. Andrew Wallace Hadrill says, the main desire of the Roman government was to make itself understood. At the start of the empire, knowledge of Greek was useful to pass as educated nobility, and knowledge of Latin was useful for a career in the military, government, or law. Bilingual inscriptions indicate the everyday interpenetration of the two languages. Latin and Greek's mutual linguistic and cultural influence is a complex topic. Latin words incorporated into Greek were very common by the early imperial era, especially for military, administration, and trade and commerce matters. Greek grammar, literature, poetry, and philosophy shaped Latin language and culture. A 5th century papyrus showing a parallel Latin-Greek text of a speech by Cicero. There was never a legal requirement for Latin in the empire, but it represented a certain status. High standards of Latin, Latinitas, started with the advent of Latin literature. Due to the flexible language policy of the empire, a natural competition of language emerged that spurred Latinitas to defend Latin against the stronger cultural influence of Greek. Over time, Latin usage was used to project power in a higher social class. Most of the emperors were bilingual but had a preference for Latin in the public sphere for political reasons, a rule that first started during the Punic Wars. Different emperors up until Justinian would attempt to require the use of Latin in various sections of the administration, but there is no evidence that a linguistic imperialism existed during the early empire. After all, freeborn inhabitants were universally enfranchised in 212, many Roman citizens would have lacked a knowledge of Latin. The wide use of Koine Greek was what enabled the spread of Christianity and reflects its role as the lingua franca of the Mediterranean during the time of the empire. Following Diocletian's reforms in the 3rd century CE, there was a decline in the knowledge of Greek in the West. Spoken Latin later fragmented into the incipient Romance languages in the 7th century CE following the collapse of the empire's West. The dominance of Latin and Greek among the literate elite obscure the continuity of other spoken languages within the empire. Latin, referred to in its spoken form as Vulgar Latin, gradually replaced Celtic and Italic languages. References to interpreters indicate the continuing use of local languages, particularly in Egypt with Coptic, and in military settings along the Rhine and Danube. Roman jurists also show a concern for local languages, such as Punic, Gaulish, and Aramaic, in assuring the correct understanding of laws and oaths. In Africa, Libyco-Berber and Punic were used in inscriptions into the 2nd century. In Syria, Palmyrene soldiers used their dialect of Aramaic for inscriptions, an exception to the rule that Latin was the language of the military. The last reference to Gaulish was between 560 and 575. The emergent Gallo-Romance languages would then be shaped by Gaulish. Proto-Basque or Aquitanian evolved with Latin loanwords to modern Basque. The Thracian language, as were several now extinct languages in Anatolia, are attested in imperial-era inscriptions. Languages of the Roman Empire. Latin and Greek were the dominant languages of the Roman Empire, but other languages were regionally important. Latin was the original language of the Romans and remained the language of imperial administration, legislation, and the military throughout the classical period. In the West, it became the lingua franca and came to be used for even local administration of the cities, including the law courts. After all, freeborn inhabitants of the empire were granted universal citizenship in 212 AD. A great number of Roman citizens would have lacked Latin, though they were expected to acquire at least a token knowledge, and Latin remained a marker of Romanness. The linguistic division of the Roman Empire, with Latin being predominant in the West and Greek being predominant in the East. Koine Greek had become a shared language around the Eastern Mediterranean and into Asia Minor as a consequence of the conquests of Alexander the Great. The linguistic frontier dividing the Latin West and the Greek East passed through the Balkan Peninsula. Educated Romans, particularly those of the ruling elite, studied and often achieved a high degree of fluency in Greek, which was useful for diplomatic communications in the East, even beyond the borders of the empire. The international use of Greek was one condition that enabled the spread of Christianity, as indicated, for example, by the choice of Greek as the language of the New Testament in the Bible and its use for the ecumenical councils of the Christian Roman Empire rather than Latin. With the dissolution of the empire in the West, Greek became the more dominant language of the Roman Empire in the East, later referred to as the Byzantine Empire. Because communication in ancient society was predominantly oral, it can be difficult to determine the extent to which regional or local languages continued to be spoken or used for other purposes under Roman rule. Some evidence exists in inscriptions or in references in Greek and Roman texts to other languages and the need for interpreters. For Punic, Coptic, and Aramaic, or Syriac, a significant amount of epigraphy or literature survives. The Paleo-Balkan languages came into contact with Latin after the Roman expansion in the Adriatic Sea in the 2nd century BC. Of the ancient Balkan languages, aside from Greek, only the precursor of Albanian survived in the Western Balkans, reflecting different chronological layers of Latin influence through contact during the entire period of spoken Latin in the region. The Celtic languages were widespread throughout much of Western Europe, and while the orality of Celtic education left scant written records, Celtic epigraphy is limited in quantity, but not rare. The Germanic languages of the empire have left next to no inscriptions or texts with the exception of Gothic. Multilingualism contributed to the cultural triangulation by means of which an individual who was neither Greek nor Roman might construct an identity through the processes of Romanization and Hellenization. After the decentralization of political power in late antiquity, Latin developed locally in the western provinces into branches that became the Romance languages, including Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, Catalan, Occitan, Aromanian, and Romanian. By the early 21st century, the first or second language of more than 1 billion people derived from Latin. Latin itself remained an international medium of expression for diplomacy and for intellectual developments identified with Renaissance humanism up to the 17th century, and for law and the Roman Catholic Church to the present. There was never an official language of the empire, however. Latin and Greek were the main languages. During the early years of the Roman Empire, educated nobles often relied on their knowledge of Greek to meet societal expectations, and knowledge of Latin was useful for a career in the military, government, or law. In the East, Greek was the dominant language, a legacy of the Hellenistic period. Greek was also the language of the Christian church and trade. Most early emperors were bilingual, but had a preference for Latin in the public sphere for political reasons, a practice that first started during the Punic Wars. Classical languages expert Bruno Rochette claims Latin had experienced a period of spread from the 2nd century BC onwards, and especially so in the western provinces, but not as much in the eastern provinces because of Diocletian's reforms. There was a decline in the knowledge of Greek in the west, and Latin was asserted as the language of power in the east, society. The empire was remarkably multicultural, with astonishing cohesive capacity to create shared identity while encompassing diverse peoples. Public monuments and communal spaces open to all, such as forums, amphitheaters, racetracks, and baths, helped foster a sense of Romanness. Roman society had multiple overlapping social hierarchies. The civil war preceding Augustus caused upheaval, but did not affect an immediate redistribution of wealth and social power. From the perspective of the lower classes, a peak was merely added to the social pyramid. Personal relationships, patronage, friendship, amicizia, family, marriage continued to influence politics. By the time of Nero, however, it was not unusual to find a former slave who was richer than a freeborn citizen, or an equestrian who exercised greater power than a senator. The blurring of the republic's more rigid hierarchies led to increased social mobility, both upward and downward, to a greater extent than all other well-documented ancient societies. Women, freedmen, and slaves had opportunities to profit and exercise influence in ways previously less available to them. Social life, particularly for those whose personal resources were limited, was further fostered by a proliferation of voluntary associations and confraternities, collegia and sodalitates, professional and trade guilds, veterans groups, religious sodalities, drinking and dining clubs, performing troupes, and burial societies. The imperial city of Rome was the largest urban center in the empire, with a population variously estimated from 450,000 to close to 1 million. Around 20% of the population under jurisdiction of ancient Rome, 25 to 40% depending on the standards used in Roman Italy, lived in innumerable urban centers, with a population of 10,000 and more and several military settlements, a very high rate of urbanization by pre-industrial standards. Most of those centers had a forum, temples, and other buildings similar to Rome's. The average life expectancy in the Middle Empire was about 26 to 28 years. Did you know that the Roman Empire is the largest empire in history? At its peak, it covered over 2 million square miles and had a population of over 1 billion people. It's no wonder that the Roman Empire is considered to be one of the greatest achievements of the ancient world. But what's even more impressive is that the Roman Empire lasted for over 2,000 years. But how did it fall? You might be surprised to learn that the Roman Empire actually fell in 2 separate events. The first was the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the year 476 AD. This was due to a number of factors, including the pressure from barbarian tribes, the decline of trade, and the rise of Christianity. However, the Eastern Roman Empire continued to thrive for another 1,000 years. In fact, it wasn't until 1453 AD that the Ottoman Turks finally conquered Constantinople, ending the Roman Empire as we know it. But what would you do if you were the ruler of the Roman Empire? Would you try to preserve it, or would you let it fall? Let me know in the comments below. Ancient Rome. In modern historiography, ancient Rome is the Roman civilization from the founding of the Italian city of Rome in the 8th century BC to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. It encompasses the Roman Kingdom, 753-509 BC, the Roman Republic, 509-27 BC, and the Roman Empire, 27 BC, 476 AD, until the fall of the Western Empire. Ancient Rome began as an Italic settlement, traditionally dated to 753 BC, beside the river Tiber in the Italian peninsula. The settlement grew into the city and polity of Rome, and came to control its neighbors through a combination of treaties and military strength. It eventually controlled the Italian peninsula, assimilating the Greek culture of southern Italy, Magna Graecia, and the Etruscan culture, and then became the dominant power in the Mediterranean region and parts of Europe. At its height, it controlled the North African coast, Egypt, southern Europe, and most of Western Europe, the Balkans, Crimea, and much of the Middle East, including Anatolia, the Levant, and parts of Mesopotamia and Arabia. That empire was among the largest empires in the ancient world, covering around 5 million square kilometers, 1.9 million square miles, in AD 117, with an estimated 50 to 90 million inhabitants, roughly 20% of the world's population at the time. The Roman state evolved from an elective monarchy to a classical republic, and then to an increasingly autocratic military dictatorship during the empire. Ancient Rome is often grouped into classical antiquity together with ancient Greece, and their similar cultures and societies are known as the Greco-Roman world. Ancient Roman civilization has contributed to modern language, religion, society, technology, law, politics, government, warfare, art, literature, architecture, and engineering. Rome professionalized and expanded its military and created a system of government called res publica, the inspiration for modern republics such as the United States and France. It achieved impressive technological and architectural feats, such as the empire-wide construction of aqueducts and roads, as well as more grandiose monuments and facilities. Legal status. According to the jurist Gaius, the essential distinction in the Roman law of persons was that all humans were either free, liberi, or slaves, servi. The legal status of free persons was further defined by their citizenship. Most citizens held limited rights, such as the ius Latinum, Latin right, but were entitled to legal protections and privileges not enjoyed by non-citizens. Free people not considered citizens, but living within the Roman world, were peregrini, non-Romans. In the Constitution, Antoniniana extended citizenship to all freeborn inhabitants of the empire. This legal egalitarianism required a far-reaching revision of existing laws that distinguished between citizens and non-citizens. Status in Roman legal system. In Roman law, status describes a person's legal status. The individual could be a Roman citizen, status civitatis, unlike foreigners, or he could be free, status libertatis, unlike slaves, or he could have a certain position in a Roman family, status familiae, either as head of the family, pater familias, or as a lower member, filii familias. Women in Roman law. Freeborn Roman women were considered citizens, but did not vote, hold political office, or serve in the military. A mother's citizen status determined that of her children, as indicated by the phrase ex duobus civibus Romanus natos, children born of 2 Roman citizens. A Roman woman kept her own family name, nomen, for life. Children most often took the father's name, with some exceptions. Women could own property, enter contracts, and engage in business. Inscriptions throughout the empire honor women as benefactors in funding public works, an indication they could hold considerable fortunes. The archaic manus marriage, in which the woman was subject to her husband's authority, was largely abandoned by the imperial era, and a married woman retained ownership of any property she brought into the marriage. Technically, she remained under her father's legal authority, even though she moved into her husband's home, but when her father died, she became legally emancipated. This arrangement was a factor in the degree of independence Roman women enjoyed compared to many other cultures up to the modern period. Although she had to answer to her father in legal matters, she was free of his direct scrutiny in daily life, and her husband had no legal power over her. Although it was a point of pride to be a one-man woman, univira, who had married only once, there was little stigma attached to divorce, nor to speedy remarriage after being widowed or divorced. Girls had equal inheritance rights with boys if their father died without leaving a will. A mother's right to own and dispose of property, including setting the terms of her will, gave her enormous influence over her sons into adulthood. Dressing of a priestess or bride, Roman fresco from Herculaneum, Italy, 3040 AD. As part of the Augustan program to restore traditional morality and social order, moral legislation attempted to regulate conduct as a means of promoting family values. Adultery was criminalized and defined broadly as an illicit sex act, stuprum, between a male citizen and a married woman, or between a married woman and any man other than her husband. That is, a double standard was in place. A married woman could have sex only with her husband, but a married man did not commit adultery if he had sex with a prostitute or person of marginalized status. Childbearing was encouraged. A woman who had given birth to 3 children was granted symbolic honors and greater legal freedom, the ius trium liberorum. Slaves and the law. At the time of Augustus, as many as 35% of the people in Roman Italy were slaves, making Rome one of 5 historical slave societies in which slaves constituted at least a fifth of the population and played a major role in the economy. Slavery was a complex institution that supported traditional Roman social structures as well as contributing economic utility. In urban settings, slaves might be professionals such as teachers, physicians, chefs, and accountants. The majority of slaves provided trained or unskilled labor. Agriculture and industry, such as milling and mining, relied on the exploitation of slaves. Outside Italy, slaves were on average an estimated 10 to 20% of the population, sparse in Roman Egypt but more concentrated in some Greek areas. Expanding Roman ownership of arable land and industries affected pre-existing practices of slavery in the provinces. Although slavery has often been regarded as waning in the 3rd and 4th centuries, it remained an integral part of Roman society until gradually ceasing in the 6th and 7th centuries with the disintegration of the complex imperial economy. Slaveholding writing tablets for his master, relief from a 4th century sarcophagus. Laws pertaining to slavery were extremely intricate. Slaves were considered property and had no legal personhood. They could be subjected to forms of corporal punishment not normally exercised on citizens, sexual exploitation, torture, and summary execution. A slave could not, as a matter of law, be raped. A slave's rapist had to be prosecuted by the owner for property damage under the Aquilian law. Slaves had no right to the form of legal marriage called connubium, but their unions were sometimes recognized. Technically, a slave could not own property, but a slave who conducted business might be given access to an individual fund, peculiar, that he could use, depending on the degree of trust and cooperation between owner and slave. Within a household or workplace, a hierarchy of slaves might exist, with one slave acting as the master of others. Talented slaves might accumulate a large enough peculiarity to justify their freedom or be manumitted for services rendered. Manumission had become frequent enough that in 2 BC, a law, lex fufia caninia, limited the number of slaves an owner was allowed to free in his will. Following the servile wars of the Republic, legislation under Augustus and his successors showed a driving concern for controlling the threat of rebellions through limiting the size of work groups, and for hunting down fugitive slaves. Over time, slaves gained increased legal protection, including the right to file complaints against their masters. A bill of sale might contain a clause stipulating that the slave could not be employed for prostitution, as prostitutes in ancient Rome were often slaves. The burgeoning trade in eunuchs in the late 1st century prompted legislation that prohibited the castration of a slave against his will for lust or gain. Roman slavery was not based on race. Generally, slaves in Italy were indigenous Italians, with a minority of foreigners, including both slaves and freedmen, estimated at 5% of the total in the capital at its peak, where their number was largest. Foreign slaves had higher mortality and lower birth rates than natives, and were sometimes even subjected to mass expulsions. The average recorded age at death for the slaves of the city of Rome was 17.5 years, 17.2 for males, 17.9 for females. During the period of Republican expansionism when slavery had become pervasive, war captives were a main source of slaves. The range of ethnicities among slaves to some extent reflected that of the armies Rome defeated in war, and the conquest of Greece brought a number of highly skilled and educated slaves. Slaves were also traded in markets and sometimes sold by pirates. Infant abandonment and self-enslavement among the poor were other sources. Vernae, by contrast, were homegrown slaves born to female slaves within the household, estate, or farm. Although they had no special legal status, an owner who mistreated or failed to care for his vernae faced social disapproval, as they were considered part of the family household, and in some cases might actually be the children of free males in the family. Slavery in ancient Rome. Slavery in ancient Rome played an important role in society and the economy. Unskilled or low-skill slaves labored in the fields, mines, and mills with few opportunities for advancement and little chance of freedom. Skilled and educated slaves, including artisans, chefs, domestic staff and personal attendants, entertainers, business managers, accountants and bankers, educators at all levels, secretaries and librarians, civil servants and physicians, occupied a more privileged tier of servitude and could hope to obtain freedom through one of several well-defined paths with protections under the law. The possibility of manumission and subsequent citizenship was a distinguishing feature of Rome's system of slavery, resulting in a significant and influential number of freed persons in Roman society. At all levels of employment, free working people, former slaves, and the enslaved mostly did the same kinds of jobs. Elite Romans whose wealth came from property ownership saw little difference between slavery and a dependence on earning wages from labor. Slaves were themselves considered property under Roman law and had no rights of legal personhood. Unlike Roman citizens, by law they could be subjected to corporal punishment, sexual exploitation, torture, and summary execution. The most brutal forms of punishment were reserved for slaves. The adequacy of their diet, shelter, clothing, and health care was dependent on their perceived utility to owners whose impulses might be cruel or situationally humane. Some people were born into slavery as the child of an enslaved mother. Others became slaves. War captives were considered legally enslaved, and Roman military expansion during the Republican era was a major source of slaves. From the 2nd century BC through late antiquity, kidnapping and piracy put freeborn people all around the Mediterranean at risk of illegal enslavement, to which the children of poor families were especially vulnerable. Although a law was passed to ban debt slavery quite early in Rome's history, some people sold themselves into contractual slavery to escape poverty. The slave trade, lightly taxed and regulated, flourished in all reaches of the Roman Empire and across borders. In antiquity, slavery was seen as the political consequence of one group dominating another, and people of any race, ethnicity, or place of origin might become slaves, including freeborn Romans. Slavery was practiced within all communities of the Roman Empire, including among Jews and Christians. Even modest households might expect to have 2 or 3 slaves. A period of slave rebellions ended with the defeat of Spartacus in 71 BC. Slave uprisings grew rare in the imperial era, when individual escape was a more persistent form of resistance. Fugitive slave hunting was the most concerted form of policing in the Roman Empire. Moral discourse on slavery was concerned with the treatment of slaves, and abolitionist views were almost non-existent. Inscriptions set up by slaves and freed persons and the art and decoration of their houses offer glimpses of how they saw themselves. A few writers and philosophers of the Roman era were former slaves or the sons of freed slaves. Some scholars who have made efforts to imagine more deeply the lived experiences of slaves in the Roman world through comparisons to the Atlantic slave trade. But no portrait of the typical Roman slave emerges from the wide range of work performed by slaves and freedmen and the complex distinctions among their social and legal statuses.